And now I'm very proud to present Professor Raymond.
Thank you, Radmila, and I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me over here and giving me this unique, for me, opportunity to give a talk in this wonderful building, which I've never been to before. And this is the first time I've been to Vienna since I researched my book many years ago. So I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. As Radmila says, I'm intending to talk about Wittgenstein in Cambridge and what Cambridge gave to Wittgenstein, what Wittgenstein gave to Cambridge. But there'll be a little bit of perhaps redundant scene setting to begin with. Talk about taking coals to Newcastle. I'm going to tell the Viennese about Vienna. But allow me for a couple of minutes. So Wittgenstein, our story really begins in 1908, which is when Wittgenstein leaves Vienna and comes to England, to Manchester. But before that, just to make sure we all know who we're talking about, this is the Wittgenstein who was brought up in this unbelievably palatial residence, now sadly no longer with us. But this is one of many houses that the Wittgenstein family had, the most opulent of them, the Palais Wittgenstein, with this incredibly grand staircase, the red salon, and this is the family in which he grew up. His parents in the middle there, Karl and Poldi. Karl was one of the richest men in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, virtually owned the iron and steel industry in the empire. Ludwig was the youngest of 8 children. He's shown there with his 3 sisters, Helena, Hermina, and Gretel. He also had brothers Rudi, Paul, Hans, and Kurt. And very quickly, I'll tell the story of the brothers. Before Wittgenstein was very old, when he was still a young child, his older son, Hans, his older brother, Hans, committed suicide. He was a musical genius of Mozartian proportions. And his father, Karl, had wanted him to go into the iron and steel business. He hadn't wanted to do that. He ran away to America and was found dead in Chesapeake Bay. Rudi killed himself in spectacularly public fashion in Berlin. He walked into a bar, ordered 2 drinks, and then shot himself. Which just left Paul and Kurt and Ludwig. Paul Wittgenstein became a concert pianist. Kurt Wittgenstein became an army officer. Many years later, he too took his own life when the forces under him deserted his command. But for Ludwig, the importance of that family tragedy was actually that he was then left to pursue his own bent. Ironically, his own bent perfectly suited his father. His father, had wanted him to be an engineer, and as it turned out, engineering was what Ludwig was good at. That didn't, however, prevent him from taking a full part in the cultural life of his family, which so central were their role in the cultural life of Vienna, that to play a cultural part in the family was to play a cultural part in the city. His father paid for the Secession building. Klimt painted this wonderful portrait of Ludwig's sister, Margareta. Brahms played regularly in the music salon in the Palais Wittgenstein, as did Joseph Labor, who was, for the whole of Ludwig's life, one of his favourite composers and musicians. So this was the life into which Ludwig Wittgenstein was born, a life of great attainment, a life that was right at the centre of Viennese cultural life in one of its most exciting and dynamic periods, but, as witnessed by the suicides of Hans and Rudolf and later Kurt, a family marked by tragedy as well as by genius. Wittgenstein, as I said, chose the path of engineering. Engineering was something that was natural natural to him. He showed an early gift for it. He left Vienna immediately to go to Berlin, where he studied engineering, and then in 1908 came to England. And his first experience of England was in Gloucester, on the hillside, flying kites, as part of aeronautical engineering, which is what he decided to specialise in. This was in the very early days of aeronautical engineering, when nobody had, got a plane to fly very far, and there was still everything to be fought for, everything to be won in the field of aeronautical engineering. It says, I think, something for the prescience of Ludwig Wittgenstein and perhaps his family, that he was encouraged to go into that particular area of engineering, which would prove to be so important and so influential in shaping the world in which we all live. His early experiments were in Gloucester, on the Pennines. For anybody who knows the Pennines, you'll understand why they were flying kites there. In all conscience, there's wind enough on the Pennines for flying kites. I guess the point of flying kites was to study various aerodynamic properties. Very quickly, though, after a month or so of flying kites, he moved to Manchester, enrolled at the University of Manchester as a research student in aeronautical engineering, and soon developed plans for his own design of engine, of an aeroplane engine. It was an unusual design that called for a combustion chamber that would pressurize gas, and then the high pressure of the gas would drive the propeller, much like one of these things that you use, a sprinkler for watering your lawn. The pressure of the water drives the propeller around, so it sprinkles the water around the lawn. That was basically the principle that Wittgenstein wanted to use in driving the propeller, so it's essentially a kind of jet propeller. Actually, a design very like Wittgenstein's was developed in the Second World War for a helicopter, but until then it was never made. Wittgenstein obviously thought it was, you could use that principle in a conventional aeroplane, but it was never made for that. What happened, though, at Manchester is that, first of all, he concentrated on the gas combustion chamber, and then he started concentrating on the design of the propeller itself, because so much depended on getting the design of the propeller right. And the design of the propeller turned out to be, more or less, a mathematical task. And so he became very interested in mathematics. And he began attending the mathematics lectures at Manchester by a very distinguished British mathematician called Littlewood. And this got him interested in pure mathematics, separate from his studies in engineering. And that got him interested in the philosophy of mathematics. And he started attending a weekly discussion group that was discussing not mathematics, and certainly not the application of mathematics to the design of propellers, but just questions of the philosophy of mathematics. So, what are these questions? Well, first and foremost, the question is, what is a number? And it's one of those philosophical questions that the more you think about it, the less obvious it seems. We all seem to know what numbers are, but then when you say, well, what is a number? It gets a bit more difficult. So, 5 plus 7 equals 12. Well, 5 apples plus 7 apples are going to equal 12 apples. But 5 plus 7 equals 12 is not about apples, it's not about oranges, it's about numbers. So what are numbers? Well, Wittgenstein started asking people in Manchester, well, who's written on this fundamental philosophical question? And a few years earlier, in 1903, Bertrand Russell, who was then at Cambridge, had published The Principles of Mathematics, which presented a very strikingly novel answer, so Russell thought anyway, to the question, what is a number? Russell's answer was that numbers are classes, and a class is a logical object. So what is a class? A class is, Russell said, to understand what a class is, you have to go back to a proposition. So you've got propositions like Socrates is wise, Plato is wise, Aristotle is wise. And you'll see that those sentences have a similar form. And you might say, well, the form can be expressed by saying X is wise. So if you gather together all those things that you can put in place of X, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, then you've got a class. You've got the class of all wise people. And what was really important about this for Russell was that it brought mathematics into the realm of logic. Previously, logic has had nothing to do with mathematics. Logic is what you learn in the humanities. Logic, if you go to a British university, Oxford or Cambridge, logic was what you learned along with your study of, Greek literature and Aristotle and Aristophanes and so on. Mathematics was what you learned in preparation for doing science. The revolutionary bit of Russell's thought was that mathematics is part of logic. Logic was concerned with statements. By giving the answer what is number, by saying numbers are classes, Russell is bringing together mathematics with logic. So logic is to do with statements. From statements you get the notion of a class, and Russell's now saying numbers are classes. As it turned out, he was anticipated in that by the German mathematician Gottlob Frege, who, unknown to Russell, had given exactly the same answer to the question, what are numbers, in his book, Grundlagen der Arithmetik. And he'd given exactly the same answer as Russell. The difference was that Russell had thought it through and thought of a huge problem with this answer, which is Russell's paradox. And I'm going to give the paradox now. Don't worry if everything I say for the next 2 minutes is gobbledygook, because I'll pass over it and we'll forget it never happened. But just in case, here goes. Here's Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox starts like this. Some classes are members of themselves. Most classes aren't. So if you gather together all the classes of tables, that class is not itself a table. If you gather all the chairs, that class is not a chair. But if you form the class of all classes, that's a class, and so that's a member of itself. So Russell says you can distinguish those classes that are members of themselves from those that aren't. All right, now, gather together the class of all those classes that are not members of themselves. And now ask, is that class a member of itself or not? And the answer is, if it is, then it shouldn't be, because it's a class of all classes that are not members of themselves. And if it's not a member of itself, then it should be, because it's a class of all classes that are not members of themselves. So if yes, then no, and if no, then yes. Which is not where a logician wants to be. This is a contradiction, and Russell, a logician abhors contradiction. And Russell wrote to Frege saying, you know what, there's a problem with our theory of numbers, which is that numbers are classes, but the notion of class seems to give rise to this contradiction. By the way, I'm finished now with Russell's paradox, you can relax, that's it. So, Russell writes to Frege and says there's a problem here with our notion, with our philosophy of mathematics. We founded number on classes, but it turns out that the notion of a class is contradictory. Frege responded to that by having a nervous breakdown. And then when he recovered, he abandoned this view of mathematics. But Russell was made of sterner stuff and stuck with it, and published in 1903 his view of mathematics as numbers are classes, but he devotes a chapter to the contradiction. And that's what got Wittgenstein going. So Wittgenstein is there in Manchester, he's studying aeronautical engineering, but he reads Russell's Principles of Mathematics and gets absolutely hooked on this question of what to do now. Given that we've got this contradiction, how do we solve it? And so, in 1909, in April 1909, which is in Wittgenstein's first year at Manchester, he's still a research student, ostensibly studying aeronautical engineering, but his sister Hermina remembers he just couldn't get over the philosophy of mathematics. He was completely obsessed. As witnessed by Philip Jourdain's correspondence book. Philip Jourdain was a mathematician, a friend of Russell's at Cambridge. And what we find is this isolated entry in his correspondence book on the 20th of April 1909. This is interesting because it's more than 2 years before Wittgenstein came to Cambridge. And it shows that even before he came to Cambridge, even before he contacted Russell or Frege, he couldn't stop thinking about the contradiction. Because he sent to Jourdain a proposed solution of the contradiction. And Jourdain doesn't say what Wittgenstein's proposed solution was, but he does say in his correspondence book that he agreed that it was no good. And that Russell agreed with him that it was no good. And then Wittgenstein goes quiet for the next couple of years. But this bears out what Hermina says in her recollections, that her brother Ludwig, once he'd come across Russell and Frege's work on the philosophy of mathematics, engineering to him had lost its allure. What he really wanted to do now was solve this problem. What he really wanted to do was make a contribution to the philosophy of mathematics, and particularly to answer the question that Russell had asked, which is, what is logic? Russell was still convinced that mathematics was logic, but he was convinced also that the contradiction, Russell's paradox, shows that we don't really understand what logic is. So having struggled between engineering on the one hand and the philosophy of mathematics on the other for 2 years, this is more than 2 years after he wrote to Jourdain, in October 1911, Wittgenstein could hold back no longer. Being Wittgenstein, being from that incredibly wealthy, influential family, he doesn't do what most of us do. He doesn't fill out forms and apply to be a student and all that. He just turns up. So Russell, here, writing to his lover, Ottoline Morel, he wrote to Ottoline 3 times a day. There were times when I wrote my biography of Russell and I wished he'd had a telephone. And also, it's testament to what a wonderful postal service we had in those days. He would write 3 letters a day to Ottoline, she would get them, reply, and he, it's just amazing. Anyway, in one of these letters, 18th of October 1911, he said that he was having tea with his friend Ogden, when he said, an unknown German appeared, speaking very little English, but refusing to speak German. He turned out to be a man who learned engineering at Charlottenburg, but during his course had acquired, by himself, a passion for the philosophy of mathematics, and has now come to Cambridge on purpose to hear me. I love that, on purpose. It's as if he wasn't just blown there, he didn't go there inadvertently, he went there on purpose to hear Russell. And then in those daily letters to Ottoline, we have how Wittgenstein is affecting Russell. Remember, Wittgenstein is not actually a student at Cambridge at this time. He just turned up to see Russell and started, as it were, almost immediately engaging him in philosophical debate. And so in the days that follow, these are all quotations from Russell's letters to Ottoline. We have things like, my German friend threatens to be an infliction. He came back with me after my lecture and argued till dinner time. Obstinate and perverse, but I think not stupid. A few days later, my German engineer, very argumentative and tiresome. He wouldn't admit that it was certain that there was not a rhinoceros in the room. He came back and argued all the time I was dressing. So Russell is giving his lectures, Wittgenstein's there, in attendance, despite not having enrolled in university. And then after the lecture, Wittgenstein's following Russell back to his rooms at Trinity. Russell's dressing for dinner. Wittgenstein's still arguing logic with him. Next day, my German engineer, I think, is a fool. He thinks nothing empirical is knowable. I asked him to admit there was not a rhinoceros in the room, but he wouldn't. All right, so what's the deal with this rhinoceros? Why are they arguing about whether there's a rhinoceros in the room or not? I think, we have to employ a certain amount of guesswork here, but I think It's to do with the question, which comes first, epistemology or metaphysics? That's to say, what is the more fundamental question? How we know things about the world, or how does the world constitute itself? What is the world made up of? And when Wittgenstein finally publishes his philosophy as Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus in 1921, the very first proposition of it is, the world is everything that is the case. And then the next proposition, the world consists of facts, not of things. And I think right at the beginning of his discussions with Russell, you've got the seeds of that idea, because I think what's at stake with this rhinoceros business, he doesn't really think it's about rhinoceros in the room, of course. But I think what's really at stake is that Wittgenstein is arguing against the view that what's fundamental here is how we can know whether there is or is not a rhinoceros in the room, and is arguing for the foundation, the fundamental question being not how we know or whether we can know that there's a rhinoceros in the room, but rather that the world consists of facts, as we would put it, not of things. And so one of those facts would be there is a rhinoceros in the room or there isn't a rhinoceros in the room, independently of whether we know it or even can know it. So on the 1st of February 1912, Wittgenstein was finally formally admitted a member of Trinity College, Cambridge. What had happened in the meantime, as we've seen, Russell was sort of torn. I mean, he was sort of inclined to think that Wittgenstein was a lunatic. And what finally persuaded him that he wasn't was when the term ended and Wittgenstein was going to go back to Vienna for the Christmas vacation, he went to see Russell and he said, look, will you please tell me whether I have any talent for philosophy or not? Because if I don't, I'm going back to Manchester and back to engineering. And Russell said, well, in English, he said, well, I don't know, boy, whether you have any talent for philosophy or not. Why don't you write something? And so Wittgenstein wrote something on philosophy during that Christmas vacation, returned to Cambridge in January 1912, and Russell says, and he's probably exaggerating a bit, but probably only a bit, he said later on that he only had to read the first sentence in order to say to Wittgenstein, no, you mustn't stick to engineering, you must change to philosophy. And very quickly, Russell's attitude to Wittgenstein changes. Instead of that rather condescending tone in which he was writing to Ottoline about Wittgenstein, we find Russell still writing daily to Ottoline, but now writing about how much he loves Wittgenstein, how Wittgenstein is the future of philosophy, in a very short period of time. And I think what this reflects is that we're not talking about Wittgenstein thinking about logic and philosophy, you know, from October 1911 to January 1912. We're talking about the product of years of intense thinking about these things. So intense that he was able to convince the leading philosopher in the world in this field that he was the future of the discipline. To begin with, though, Wittgenstein was assigned a tutor, as students tend to be. But that lasted just a couple of sessions. He was assigned W.E. Johnson, who was then a fairly distinguished logician, used to teaching bright young undergraduates at Cambridge the foundations of logic. Wittgenstein said, I found in the first hour that he had nothing to teach me. And so within a couple of sessions, Johnson stopped being Wittgenstein's teacher. Of more importance to Wittgenstein was his introduction to G.E. Moore, who was a philosopher at Cambridge and a friend of Bertrand Russell's, who was giving lectures on the philosophy of psychology at the time in Cambridge. Wittgenstein went to those lectures. That's Moore there, by the way, in the middle of the picture with the pipe. The man on Moore's right is John Maynard Keynes, the distinguished economist. Moore and Keynes were friends. And Moore gave these lectures. Wittgenstein attended the lectures. One of the things that struck Moore, as he said to Russell, was that Wittgenstein always looked puzzled. And Moore was rather impressed by this because he thought that being puzzled was the appropriate response to a series of philosophical questions. And what Russell says to Ottoline is, Moore thinks enormously highly of Wittgenstein's brains. Says he always feels Wittgenstein must be right when they disagree. So notice the date, 5th of March 1912. Within a few months, Wittgenstein, this unknown German as he was described just a few months earlier, has now impressed the two most distinguished philosophers at Cambridge and therefore in the UK, and two of the most distinguished philosophers in the world. Moore was particularly lauded by the group of intellectuals known as the Bloomsbury Group. Now, this was a group of intellectuals centred in Bloomsbury in London. It included Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell, Lytton Strachey, Duncan Grant, the writer on aesthetics, Clive Bell. And it had a kind of Cambridge outpost, the Bloomsbury Group, which was the semi-secret society called the Apostles. The Apostles were a group of Cambridge undergraduates and fellows who met every week to discuss an intellectual topic. And the Apostles, you couldn't just join the Apostles, you couldn't apply to join the Apostles, it had to be by invitation only. And such was Wittgenstein's impact on Cambridge that, you know, by the spring of 1912, he was being sought out by the Apostles, and in particular by Lytton Strachey, who was already by that time a well-known novelist and a leading member of both the Apostles and the Bloomsbury Group. Other members of this group, John Maynard Keynes, who became the leading economist of the UK, particularly after the First World War, with his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Virginia Woolf, who was establishing herself and would continue establishing herself as the leading novelist of her generation, and she would, you know, continue to develop in that respect throughout the 1920s. It was a self-consciously elite society, and it says much about Wittgenstein's impact, that he was being scouted, he was being courted by that society. It also, I think, is indicative of Wittgenstein's temperament and personality, that he didn't really care for the Apostles or the Bloomsbury. The person in Cambridge that he met in his first year who had the greatest impact on him and who he liked more than any other person that he met during that time was David Pinsent. David Pinsent was an undergraduate mathematician. He came from a sort of, you know, traditional middle-class British family, but he wasn't a member of the Apostles, and he didn't mix with Strachey and John Maynard Keynes and Virginia Woolf and so on. He kept humbler company, as it were. But he's the person that Wittgenstein sought out. When Wittgenstein met Pinsent, he insisted on meeting him again. And Pinsent says in his diary, 31st of May 1912, I'd only known Wittgenstein for 3 weeks or so, but we seemed to get on very well together. He was very musical, with the same taste as I. On that occasion, Wittgenstein alarmed Pinsent, both alarmed him and delighted him, by inviting him on an all-expenses-paid holiday to Iceland, which they would do in the summer of 1912. What he suggested was that they hire horses and go on a horse riding trek through the Icelandic countryside. As it happened, the 100th anniversary of that trek was last summer, and I was kindly invited by some people who both own horses in Iceland and are Wittgenstein enthusiasts. They suggested recreating the trail that Wittgenstein and Pinsent did, and they invited me to go with them. And I did, and I can tell you that it's really hard work. And I didn't manage to do half of what Pinsent and Wittgenstein did. They must have been incredibly good horse riders and have incredible stamina. But anyway, as a result of that holiday in Iceland, the bond between Wittgenstein and Pinsent became ever closer. And The following year, Wittgenstein invited Vincent on a holiday in Norway. Vincent really liked the holiday in Iceland. It was adventurous. They were seeing geysers, they were seeing mountains, they were seeing glaciers, and they were going through lovely countryside. The holiday in Norway the following year, in the summer of 1913, Vincent, you can tell from his diary, actually found it a bit boring, because all that Wittgenstein did during that summer was sit in his room overlooking the field, thinking about logic. Because by that time, Wittgenstein took very seriously the remark that Russell had made to his sister. In the summer of 1912, Hermina came to Cambridge and Russell said to her, "We expect the next big step in philosophy to come from your brother." That was both a tremendous honour for him to say that, but it also put a tremendous pressure on Wittgenstein. And so, from that moment onwards, you see Wittgenstein trying to live up to that extraordinary burden, trying to make the big breakthrough that he always felt was imminent, and particularly in the summer of 1913 when he took Vincent on a holiday to Norway. He kept worrying that he was going to die before he put it on paper. Remember, there's nothing on paper up to now. Up till the summer of 1913, nothing exists by Wittgenstein on paper, which is, apart from a very short review of a traditional textbook on logic. But of all the work that Russell comments on, that give Russell the feeling that Wittgenstein is going to be the future of philosophy, there's not a word. And so in the summer of 1913, you find Wittgenstein wanting to think about nothing else. And so he came back from his holiday in Norway and announced to Russell that he would now be leaving Cambridge and going to Norway to work on logic on his own. And Russell said, "I said it would be dark," and he said he hated daylight. "I said it would be lonely," and he said he prosecuted his mind talking to intelligent people. "I said he was mad," and he said, "God preserve him from sanity. God certainly will." So the year 1913 to 14, Wittgenstein spent in Norway working on logic. And he did get something before he left for Norway. He dictated some notes on logic to Russell that indicated the way in which he wanted to go. And the way in which he wanted to go was he wanted to leave behind the idea that Frege and Russell had had, that logic has a subject matter, and its subject matter consists in the study of abstract Platonic forms. He wanted to leave that behind. While in Norway, he summoned G.E. Moore from Cambridge to Norway to take notes. We Wittgenstein scholars probably don't find this as extraordinary as we should do. The two most eminent philosophers in the country are prepared to act as Wittgenstein's secretaries at a time when he, officially at least, is still just an undergraduate. But anyway, G.E. Moore was prepared to go to Norway to trek up the field, find this incredibly remote, isolated house, and take dictation, basically, from Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein had a new idea to dictate to G.E. Moore, which was this: that in logic, we must distinguish between what we can say and what has to show itself. So Wittgenstein now thought that one of the ways in which Russell and Frege were going wrong was that they were trying to say what logical entailment and logical inference were. Whereas Wittgenstein thought that if you understood things rightly, you would understand that you can't say that. You had to let it show itself in your grasp of your ordinary language. So we use ordinary language. That ordinary language carries with it a series of logical entailments. So, what do we mean when we talk about logical entailment? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. You can see that that's a valid argument. But you can't then say why it's a valid argument. Because the language in which you would try and say why it's valid presupposes the forms that make it valid. It's like trying to, on a sunny day you can see your own shadow, and so you might try to jump on your own shadow, but of course you can't because your shadow moves with you. Well, likewise, you can't use language to express form. It's always going to stay out of reach of your language. And so, what in the notes that he dictated to Moore, right at the beginning of those notes, is the idea that there are some things that we cannot say, but we can show. That's a pretty good moment to stop if that works time-wise.
This was the first Cambridge period.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here now we have Matthias Bartolomei with the Britten and Bach cello suites.
Thank
Thank you very much, Matthias. And now we can continue. Ray? Okay.
Right, okay. Thank you very much, that was wonderful. It's also just about the most wonderfully Viennese thing conceivable, I think, having a cello recital in the middle of electron Wittgenstein. So where were we? Oh yes, he was in Norway, and when he left Cambridge for Norway in the summer of 1913, he wouldn't return to Cambridge again until 1929. And so I just want to, our theme is Wittgenstein in Cambridge, and we'll get back to that very soon, but I just want to fill in those gaps. So towards the end of his time in Norway, having dictated those notes to Moore, which he then expected Moore to go back and relate to Russell, he then had a house built himself, this house here. He designed it himself, he had it built in a particularly remote part of Norway that was especially difficult to get to. And his idea was to stay in that house until he finished a book that would solve once and for all the problems about the nature of logic, and particularly the nature of propositions that had been plaguing Russell. However, in the summer of 1914, he was unable to return to Norway because the First World War broke out. And he couldn't get back to Norway, but in any case he decided to volunteer for the war. Russell, meanwhile, was campaigning against the war, and was rather surprised by Wittgenstein's decision to fight in it. And in his autobiography, Russell quips that he has a sentence that goes something like, Wittgenstein, though a logician, was both a patriot and a pacifist. And was clearly puzzled why Wittgenstein would enlist. Part of the reason was his patriotism, but I think another part of the reason was that he'd become persuaded that he would be a better person for having the experience of facing death. And the reason for that was that he'd been reading William James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and discovering that, what William James does in this book is relate the experiences of people who had a profound religious experience and ask them to describe what had happened. And in many cases, the experience follows from it is a result of having faced death. And so Wittgenstein got the idea that if he enlisted in the war, he would face death and undergo the profound revelation that William James experiences. Not that he wanted a religious belief exactly, but he thought that it would bring a depth to his life, a depth to his being, as it were, that wasn't there before. So he enlisted in the war as a private, wanted to be sent to the front, but it would be a couple of years before his desire was realised in that respect, because the authorities, seeing that he was a Wittgenstein, and the Wittgensteins were from a very wealthy family, put him to a safe position behind the lines, and he kept applying to go to the front, and they kept thinking he wanted to go safer and safer, so they kept moving him further and further behind the lines. And it wasn't until 1916 that he got his wish, and finally he was moved to the Russian front, which, God knows is dangerous enough. In the meantime, he had bought this book, Leo Tolstoy, The Gospel in Brief, and it was he was in Galicia, and he went to a bookshop. The bookshop only had one book, which was this book, and so Wittgenstein bought it. And from that moment onwards was known as the man with the Gospels, because he was never seen without his edition of Tolstoy's Gospels. He read it and reread it, and he did indeed undergo a religious conversion. He took with him the manuscripts that he was working on logic in Norway, and his perhaps optimistic, possibly bizarre idea was that he would finish his work on logic while fighting in the First World War. But his manuscripts are preserved, and they show him wrestling with ideas about the nature of logic, the nature of propositions. Until this moment, until the moment of 1916, when in these journals, where previously he's been talking about logic, he suddenly asks himself, what do I know about God and the purpose of life? And he answers, to believe in a God means to understand the meaning of life. To believe in God means to see that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter. The solution to the problem of life is to be seen in the disappearance of the problem. Isn't this the reason why men to whom the meaning of life had become clear after long doubting could not say what this meaning consisted in? Now remember, in his logic work, he had come to the point of distinguishing what one can say and what one can show, and insisting that the nature of logic has to show itself. Now he extends that idea to the meaning of life. The meaning of life is not something that one can write down, not something that one can say. It's something that shows itself to one, as it were, in life. And so this idea that previously he'd applied only to logic, he now puts into his book, which became known as Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And the book as a whole then consists of 5/6 of it is all about logic and the proposition. And the final 1/6 is all about God, the meaning of life. ethics and aesthetics. And uniting those two parts of the book is the idea of the inexpressible. As he puts it in the book, there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. When he read the poem Count Eberhard's Hawthorne, he wrote to his friend Paul Engelman, "This is how it is. If only you do not try to utter what is unutterable, then nothing gets lost. But the unutterable will be unutterably contained in what is uttered." So, in poetry, in music, in literature, what we're after is the transcendental, the ineffable, that which cannot be stated. But somehow or other we manage to do something, play something, say something, which unutterably contains the unutterable. In art, he says, it's as hard to say anything that's as good as saying nothing. So at the end of the war, and he didn't get back to Vienna until 1919 because he, having served on the Russian front after the Russian Revolution, he was moved to the Italian front and then was made an Italian prisoner of war, and there was that period immediately after the war when the Italians hung on to all their prisoners to use as negotiating material. Wittgenstein was one of those, and so wasn't free to go when the war ended in 1918, but a year later in 1919. But remarkably, when he came home from Vienna, he came home with his book already finished. And then he had a struggle to get it published, but it finally was published in both English and German in 1921. And it laid out his answer to the questions that had been bedeviling Russell and Frege about logic, and it laid out this mystical view about the importance of that which cannot be said. He wrote to a prospective publisher and said, look, my book consists of two parts. There's the part that's written and the part that isn't written. And precisely that second part is the more important. That's not a way to sell a book to a publisher. So the publisher wasn't biting, but he did get it published. And, it remains true that what's really important with Wittgenstein is that which we cannot say, and therefore that which is not said in the book, which makes it a unique work of philosophy. It's a unique work of philosophy in combining, an analysis of logic that we analytic philosophers can do something with, and the expression of the importance of the ineffable, which by and large analytic philosophers have not known what to do with. Nevertheless, he said in the preface of the book that it solves all the problems of philosophy. He was not, as we've seen, a modest man, and he thought this was it, that was philosophy done with. So he gave up philosophy and actually trained to be a primary school teacher. And he taught in a series of schools in Lower Austria. It was not a success. He was not a great teacher of young children. And what happened while he was teaching in the Lower Austrian villages is that bit by bit he was enticed back to Cambridge. And the man who did most of the enticing was this man, Frank Ramsey, who was a very young man in his 20s, made a fellow of King's College, Cambridge, very brilliant on so many fields, Frank Ramsey. He was a brilliant mathematician. He made fundamental contributions to economics, to philosophy, to set theory. Not bad for somebody who died when he was 30. He was an extraordinary man. And he had a hand in the English edition of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He became convinced that although it was the most important work of philosophy of the 20th century, it wasn't, as Wittgenstein thought, the final word on the subject. And so he went, Frank Ramsey trekked all the way to Lower Austria, to Puchberg, to seek out Wittgenstein, to go through the book with him line by line, as a result of which Wittgenstein was persuaded that it wasn't, after all, the last word on philosophy. So when he was kicked out of school teaching, he went back to Vienna And then, it almost irresistibly, he designed a house, he worked for a while in a monastery garden, but it was sort of inevitable by that stage that he would return to philosophy and that he would return to Cambridge, which he did in January 1929. He returned to Cambridge officially as Frank Ramsey's student, research student. But of course, the reality was that he and Ramsey would work together, trying to work out where he had gone wrong in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So in January 1929, he was met by John Maynard Keynes, who wrote to his wife, "Well, God has arrived. I met him on a 5:15 train." Wittgenstein was by this time a legend in Cambridge. His book had been out for 8 years. It had been intensely studied by all the bright young philosophers at Cambridge. And so he was well known even before he arrived. He moved into Whewell's Court in Trinity College. His rooms are those right at the top of that tower there, which he had for many years, directly above the rooms of the poet A.E. Housman. Wittgenstein lived there. He started giving lectures in 1930, that's his college portrait. And he started making close friends among his students. His best friend in those years was Francis Skinner, with whom he's pictured here walking through Cambridge. Francis Skinner was a young, impressionable, very intelligent mathematics student who attended Wittgenstein's lectures and devoted himself to Wittgenstein, as did Gilbert Patterson, who wasn't a philosopher at all, but Wittgenstein befriended Gilbert Patterson. And I think partly what he liked about Gilbert was that he had no interest in philosophy. I came across Gilbert Patterson's name when I was researching my book and was curious to know who he was, because he doesn't turn up in any philosophical context. And eventually I tracked him down, and he lived in Sussex in England. He'd become immensely wealthy, having gone into banking, and he lived in this enormous pile in Sussex. And I met him, and we talked about Wittgenstein. He was very charming. He had one of those, old, bufferish English voices. And I said to him, "Well, did you ever discuss philosophy with Wittgenstein?" And Bill said, "Oh, no, it was hard and stupid." He also talked about communism. Wittgenstein in the 1930s developed an idea that he might want to settle in the Soviet Union. And I asked Gilbert about that, and he said, "Oh yes, we're all communists in those days, He said, "Much as you might be a Buddhist nowadays." So communism in the 1930s was very fashionable among the Cambridge undergraduates. It's not often that Wittgenstein's views go hand in hand with fashion. And it's not entirely clear that Wittgenstein was drawn to the Soviet Union because he'd become politically a communist, although clearly he wasn't opposed to communism. But in the 1930s, he did go as far as going to visit the Soviet Union in 1935, applying for a job, applying for a visa. The nearest we've got to satisfying explanation as to why he wanted to go to the Soviet Union is his remark to Francis Skinner. He said that he wanted to lead a life without the honey. He wanted a life of austerity. It was a bit like his desire in the First World War to face death, because that would give his life a kind of depth that it didn't have before. I think what he was looking for in the 1930s was a refuge from any kind of pampering, a refuge from any kind of sort of closeting and cosy life. And he thought that he would find that in the Soviet Union. Thank God he wasn't accepted by the Soviet Union. He returned to Cambridge to work on his philosophy. Then finally there's another picture of when Francis Skinner died in the 1930s. Wittgenstein's closest friend became Ben Richards, and he's pictured here walking through Liverpool. They're on their way to Ireland here, and Ben became Wittgenstein's closest friend after after Francis Skinner's death. Okay, so what's happening philosophically, intellectually for Wittgenstein? So, he's been persuaded by Frank Ramsey that what he says in the Tractatus isn't the last word. And the problems seem to centre on the notion of logical form, that which cannot be expressed. Wittgenstein's idea at the time of the Tractatus was that the world is structured. The world has, so to speak, a form. And we can think about the world. And the reason we can think about the world is that we can form thoughts that share a structure with the facts of the world. And then we can put those thoughts into words. So we have three things. We have the world, we have our thinking about the world, and we have our speech, we have our language. The world, thought, language. Wittgenstein's idea is that what unites those three is logical form, the structure. And logical form cannot be expressed in words, because it's a thing that every utterance presupposes. Well, when he returned to Cambridge in 1929, he met regularly with Frank Ramsey. He wasn't entirely happy with that, because although Frank Ramsey was extraordinarily intelligent, he wasn't a man for rooting out ideas. Wittgenstein wrote in his journal that Frank Ramsey was an ideal person to go to if you want the details of something ironed out and perfected. But he wasn't the man for looking at, for pulling out roots. The man for that was this man, Piero Straffa, who was an economist. Not very well known, Straffa, but those people who did know him at Cambridge thought of him as unbelievably intelligent, seemed to know everything about politics, about economics, and about philosophy. And Wittgenstein used to go and see Straffa every week. One of my biggest regrets when I worked on my book is that the papers that record their discussions have not survived. Wittgenstein, after discussing philosophy with Straffa, used to go back to his rooms at Whewell's Court and write out what they had discussed. And he regarded those transcripts of his conversations as so important, he kept them in a safe. For Wittgenstein, they were more important than anything else he owned. And yet, they disappeared. And it's a great mystery where they disappeared to. And who knows, one day they might reappear. I guess we'll have to wait for Wittgenstein to go out of copyright. But one day they're going to reappear, I think. And they're terribly important because it was Straffa who persuaded Wittgenstein to give up the entire notion of logical form. And one anecdote that Wittgenstein told his friends about this was that in his discussions, Straffa, tried to persuade Wittgenstein there was something fundamentally wrong with this notion of logical form as applied to language. And one of Straffa's points was that in language we don't just make statements. We don't just use language to utter propositions that are either true or false. We also, for example, make gestures. Straffa was Italian, and there's an Italian gesture that consists of brushing your fingers under your chin. And Straffa said to Wittgenstein, "What's the logical form of that?" And that, it's like a penny dropped for Wittgenstein. It's like, right, okay, so language does not get its meaning from having a form in common with statements. Rather, there is a multiplicity of ways in which language can get its meaning. There isn't a logical form. And so his later work consists in him, in some respects, retracing his footsteps, trying to work out how one falls into the trap of thinking that there is a logical form. And he starts to think that all philosophical theses, all philosophical theories have that same mistake. But there's something wrong, he begins to think, with any kind of philosophical theory, because every philosophical theory is attempting to impose unity where really there is multiplicity. And so he came to think that his role in philosophy was to preserve the multiplicity, to remind philosophers. And he thought it was just a question of reminding. He didn't think that he was putting forward any novel philosophical theory here. He thought that what required doing was reminding philosophers of what was manifestly the case, that we use language in a wide variety of ways. In Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he'd identified three ways in which we use language. We use language to say that something is true, the door is closed. We use language to ask a question, is the door closed? And we use language to utter an imperative, close the door. So we have statements, questions, imperatives. In philosophical investigations, he says, how many different kinds of language are there? Let's say, statements, questions, imperatives. He said, no, there are countless forms of language. Think, he says, of making a joke, of telling a riddle, of forming a blueprint, of expressing an emotion, of telling somebody you love them, and so on and so on. There are loads of ways in which we use language that escape the attempt to shoehorn them into one category or even three categories. The notion of family resemblance became crucial to the philosophy that he worked out in his second period at Cambridge from 1929 until he left Cambridge in 1947. Here's four pictures. Three of his sisters, Gretel, Helena, Emina, and then Ludwig himself. And then on the left, there's a composite picture. You don't notice at first that it's a composite picture. It looks, to begin with, like just a single person, a person of sort of strangely indeterminate sex, but nevertheless a single person. But then you look below the chin and you see, hang on, what's going on there? You've got a necklace, you've got an open shirt, you've got a scarf. It's these pictures superimposed on one another. And what Wittgenstein found fascinating about it is that when you put pictures one on top of another, you can literally see connections between the faces. In this case, you can see the extraordinary similarity of the eyes of the Wittgenstein siblings. But the point is, you don't have to have that spelled out. And it's not something that you need words for. You can see it. So he says in Philosophical Investigations that in place of philosophical theorizing, what he's aiming to achieve is what he called the kind of understanding that consists in seeing connections. Now, this is a direct descendant of his distinction between showing and saying. Only now we've got rid of the notion of logical form. There is no logical form. That's a philosopher's myth. There is no logical form holding those things together. What there is a way of seeing connections. And the various consequences of that. One of which is we can now, once we've got this idea of a family resemblance, we can understand that many of the concepts we use do not have a single entity or a single essence which is common to them all. Much like in family resemblances, you might say, well, it may not be the case that all the members of the Wittgenstein family have the same eyes, or have the same nose, or have the same chin. Some of them might have the same eyes, another group might have the same chin, and another group might have the same nose. And those groups will be interlocking. There'll be a series of similarities and dissimilarities that go up to make a family. Well, Wittgenstein says the same thing is true of many of our concepts. Think of the concept of a game, for example. There are some team games. There are some individual games. There are some board games, ball games. Games that are competitive, games that are not. Games that are played for money, games that aren't. card games, all sorts of games. Is there one thing that all those things have in common? Some philosophers think like this. They ask a question, like Socrates in the Platonic dialogues. He'll ask a question, what is truth? Or in the Euthyphro he asks, what is piety? Or what is justice? And then invariably in one of those dialogues people will start giving Socrates examples. Say, well look, here's an example of what we call justice. Here's some examples of what we call truth. Here's some examples of what we call piety. And then Socrates will say, no, I don't want examples. I want to know what truth or piety is. I want the essence. Well, now Wittgenstein would say at that point, now you're making the mistake that leads to the kind of thing that led him into thinking there was such a thing as logical form. You're trying to impose a unity where there is a fundamental multiplicity. There is no single logical form, and there's no one thing that all examples of piety have in common, or all examples of truth have in common, or all examples of games have in common. Those concepts are family resemblance concepts. There are a series of similarities, a series of dissimilarities, and we just, as philosophers, have to deal with it. And if we don't deal with it, if we try to squeeze a concept into a single form, we'll end up with a mistaken philosophical theory. In connection with that, also, Wittgenstein emphasized what he called seeing aspects. And he used this figure of the duck rabbit. Okay, so you look at it one way, and on the left there, that's the beak of the duck. You look at it another way, and what was the beak of the duck is now the ears of the rabbit. And you can change how you see it. You can see it now as a duck, and now as a rabbit. So you can see it in two different ways. But now, when you change from seeing it as a duck to seeing it as a rabbit, what changes? This doesn't change. I'm not changing anything here when you see it now as a duck and now as a rabbit. A temptation is to say, well, it's not the outside image that changes, it's the inside image that changes. But that can't be right either, because the inside image is going to be as ambiguous as the outside image. So it's not, when you look for something that has changed, again, if you try to answer that by identifying something, you're falling into a characteristic philosophical error. There's no thing that has changed. What's changed is the way you look at it. Similarly, says Wittgenstein, in philosophy, what's required with any of these questions like what is truth, what is meaning, is not, and nowadays, what is consciousness? What is the mind? Russell's question, what is number? It's a mistake to think that we answer those questions by identifying, by producing something, like Russell tried to produce a class. Numbers are classes. Instead of which, Wittgenstein suggests, we should look at these things as family resemblances. We should change the way we look at the problem. Just like we can see it now as a duck, now as a rabbit. Change the way we look at the problem so we're not forcing ourselves to try and identify something that is a number, or something that is the mind, or something that is piety. So the root of Wittgenstein's later philosophy is a kind of assault. It's a unique contribution to philosophy. In the, over 2,000 years of history of philosophy, Wittgenstein's later philosophy is a unique contribution. Unique because it campaigns against forming general theories. It campaigns against generality and consists in reminders of what is the case and a constant evocation to look at things in a different way. He says in Investigations, don't think, look. Well, he tried throughout the 30s to get these thoughts into some kind of order. He tried a number of different ways. He tried in his lectures, and then he one year he said, right, I'm not doing any lectures, I'm just dictating my ideas to my students. And then he tried giving up and going to Norway again, going back to the house that he had built, trying to write a definitive account of his later ideas there. And in the process, he acquired disciples. And here's some of the three best known of Wittgenstein's disciples. Elizabeth Anscombe became a very significant philosopher in her own right, and she studied with Wittgenstein in the early 40s and became devoted to him. She became one of his literary executors, as did Russian Rees, who also studied with him in the 40s, and slightly earlier in the 1930s, this man on the right, Norman Malcolm, studied with him. And characteristic of all the people who studied with Wittgenstein, who stayed the course, was their complete and utter devotion to him. It's true, I think, to call them disciples rather than students. And this aroused the suspicion and the disapproval of many of the old guard of British philosophy, of whom we now count Bertrand Russell. So, we last saw Bertrand Russell in 1913 persuading Wittgenstein not to go to Norway. A lot happened to Russell in the intervening period. During the First World War, he campaigned against Britain's involvement, and when he suggested that US troops might be used to break strikes in Britain, he was imprisoned for that for a while. That didn't bother him particularly. When he came out of prison, he was asked what it was like, and he said, well, it's much like being on a cruiser. He wasn't particularly affected by it. He gave up philosophy too, but for a very different reason to Wittgenstein. He gave up philosophy because when he was campaigning against British involvement in the First World War, and when he was in prison, Trinity College stripped him of his fellowship. And Russell was so angered by that he refused to go back to Cambridge even when they invited him back in the 1920s. And he made his living primarily as a public speaker and as a journalist. Until the Second World War, when Russell went to America, took up academic positions, first in Chicago, then at UCLA, and then finally in Pennsylvania. And then finally, shortly before the war finished, Russell returned to Trinity, and finally he forgave Trinity, Trinity forgave him, and he went back as a fellow and devoted himself to philosophy. However, by that time, much to Russell's dismay, he found that he had become unfashionable, and Wittgenstein had become enormously fashionable. Not only that, but Russell wasn't at all impressed with Wittgenstein's later philosophy. All this talk about seeing and not thinking, and seeing things in a different way, and so on and so on. And so Russell said, the later Wittgenstein seems to have grown tired of serious thinking, and to have invented a doctrine which would make such an activity unnecessary. The two were never really reconciled. Russell continued to be dismayed at Wittgenstein's influence on a whole generation of philosophers at both Cambridge and at Oxford. And Wittgenstein continued to regard Russell's philosophical output as irredeemably superficial. And actually it was Wittgenstein, amazing, you tend to think of Wittgenstein as a less academic figure than Russell, but actually it was Wittgenstein who was made professor of philosophy at Cambridge. Russell never was. Russell was given his fellowship at Trinity, but Russell was never professor of philosophy at Cambridge. Wittgenstein was from 1939 till 1947. And in 1947, he left, similar really to his leaving Cambridge in 1913. He really wanted to finish a book that would reflect his later philosophy. And so instead of decamping to Norway, he decided to go to this remote cottage on the west coast of Ireland, where he lived alone, and he devoted himself to his work. The cottage was owned by a friend of his called Maurice Drury, whose family owned quite a lot of land and property in Ireland. It's in Donegal. Yeah. I went there, and the Drury family employed a man called Paddy, inevitably, whose job it was to go to the cottage every morning and make sure that Wittgenstein had enough peat, which is what they used to heat the properties in that part of the world, and also to make sure that you had enough food and so on. And he told me that every morning when he got to the cottage, there would be a pile of manuscripts there which Wittgenstein wanted him to burn. Because Wittgenstein would be writing his book, and the discarded stuff he'd give to Paddy to burn. And I said to Paddy, well, weren't you tempted to keep this stuff? Now it would be worth a fortune. And Paddy said, oh no, it had writing all over it. So Wittgenstein spent 2 years in Ireland working on, he didn't actually get a finished version of his book. And he was getting increasingly ill. He returned to Cambridge, where he was diagnosed as having cancer. And these are the last photographs taken of him in Cambridge. He's there with his, I mentioned Elizabeth Anscombe and Rush Rees. This is the third of his appointed literary executors, George von Frick, who was a Finnish philosopher who lived in Cambridge at that time. And here the two are in the garden. You can see, I think, by the gauntness of Wittgenstein's face. I mean, he was a handsome man, he always looked good, but he is looking rather gaunt there, and he didn't have long to live after that. And he died in 1951 at this house, Story's End, which was the house of his doctor, Dr. Bevan, who had diagnosed him as having cancer. And he moved in with Dr. Bevan, carried on working, actually, until his dying day. And on the day of his death, he said to Mrs. Bevan, Joan Bevan, he said to Joan, tell them I've had a wonderful life. Would you have? Thank you.
This has been incredible. Ray is quite ready to answer questions, so please, if anybody has a question to ask after all we have heard, use your chance now. Yeah. Oh yeah.
As I'm informed, he loved to take photographs and put them into sketchbooks. And do they still exist somewhere in the archive?
Yes, they do. He took a lot of very tiny photographs. He bought a camera in the old Woolworths. Did you have Woolworths in Vienna? No. We had Woolworths. It was an American thing that came to Britain. And their boast was that everything costs, what was it, a shilling? Sorry? A nickel, but in the UK, a shilling. So everything costs a shilling. And of course, you couldn't buy a camera for a shilling, but you could buy parts of the camera. And that's what Wittgenstein did. He bought parts of the camera from Woolworths until he had a camera, which took very basic little photographs. But he was very proud of these photographs, and he used to shave them until he got the... proportions were so important for Wittgenstein. His house, the beauty of his house is all about the proportions of the windows and the door. Well, similarly, when he took photographs, when he then edited them, so to speak, it would all be about the proportions. And he kept them. Yeah, so he used to cut them, but then he'd shave little bits off with a razor blade, with an ink razor blade. And he had a little album, which wasn't a proper photo album. It was a sort of school exercise book, lined paper. And he put these little tiny photographs in this exercise book. Include that picture of Gilbert Patterson that I put up there, that's one of his pictures. And they would all be, you know, very carefully edited. And they do have a certain kind of beauty in those pictures. He took pictures of Gilbert Patterson, he took pictures of Francis Skinner, of Ben Richard, when he came back to Vienna, he took pictures of his Aunt Clara. And he was very selective, he didn't keep many pictures, but those that he did keep, he kept in a little book, and that book does survive in the Wren Library in Cambridge.
Sorry, my last question. Yes. Do you think it's a rumor, or is it true that he, in the 20s, I think it was that the Scotch tape was invented, and that he also loved to take the Scotch tape and for having the proportions right when he was looking out of the window?
He did. That's right. So in his room at Cambridge, he taped it up so that his windows looking out from his room at Kewell's Court, out onto the court, that those windows would have the right proportions. That's not a rumour, that's true. Yes. Perhaps we should ask them.
Any other questions? Yeah.
As Bertrand Russell said, he referred to Wittgenstein as a German, and I'm wondering why he would leave his German environment. What drew him to the Anglo-Saxon idiom of England and Cambridge?
Yeah, perhaps I should have made a bit more about this, actually. I mean, one thing to say about that is that the University of Cambridge is probably the only university in the world that would have given Wittgenstein the opportunities that he had. He wouldn't have got in here, in Vienna. Oxford wouldn't have touched him. I think Cambridge is the only university in the world that would have the flexibility to, first of all in 1912, to make him a registered student just because Bertrand Russell happens to like him. And then in 1929 to make him a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, just because he happens to be, you know, everybody likes him. He hadn't had any formal education, was he? He'd never studied Aristotle. To his dying day, he didn't study Aristotle. He read a bit of Plato, but he didn't study Aristotle. He hadn't studied Locke, Berkeley, Hume. He would have stood no chance of becoming a fellow of any of the Oxford colleges, or even an undergraduate at Oxford. So I think Cambridge is the only, and I think full credit to Cambridge for giving him those opportunities. So your question was, why did he leave Vienna? And I think, well, the first reason for that was that he wanted to study with Bertrand Russell. Why Bertrand Russell rather than Gottlob Frege? Well, he went to see Frege, and Frege advised him to go and work with Russell. Make of that what you will. I suspect he drove Frege crazy. And also credit to Russell, because his initial reaction, as we've seen in those letters to Otto, is that he thought Wittgenstein was a big man. But he didn't throw him out. He